All good things come to an end, Jean-Luc, and that goes for graphics cards as much as it does the human race. After an extended run of continued gaming relevance, known in the community as fine wine tech, the AMD Radeon GCN graphics cards from 2012 through to 2015 finally lost official driver support in the summer of 2021, at a time when we needed them most. The modding community, however, weren't taking this lying down. Amernime Zone has been modding Radeon drivers back as far as terascale, and thanks to their efforts it's now possible to use GCN 1, 2 and 3 cards with some of the most recent AMD drivers, despite them being officially incompatible. From my own experiences and those of my community, some games released or updated since the last official driver set have had several issues with these cards. The hope then is that the NimeZ drivers will breathe some life into these old graphics cards, particularly with newly released games. To test this, I'm running 3 graphics cards on a handful of modern games. Representing the OG GCN, I have the R9 283GB, essentially a rebrand of the HD 7950. For the second generation, I have an R9 290, and finally, representing the third gen, I have an R9 Fury X. These cards offer wildly differing levels of performance, so don't worry too much about how they compare against one another. All 3 cards have their own dedicated benchmarking videos coming in the coming weeks. Instead, I'm comparing driver sets, looking for fixes for known problems, as well as improvements to performance. Driver set 1 is the official 21.5.2 legacy release from AMD. Driver set 2 is the NimeZ version of 21.12.1 version 3. In choosing which games to test, I went with titles that had given me or my audience problems on the latest driver release, or games that had launched or significantly updated since May of 2021. Doom Eternal was top of my personal list for this video. In testing the R9 280X and R9 270 last year, I'd seen some weird glowing artifacts, especially on the Mancubus, and I wondered if this was something the new driver set might fix. I tested this action-heavy scene, which is only about 2 minutes long, but encapsulates most of the issues I've seen with the game so far. Halo Infinite is the first Halo game that was released on PC simultaneously with the Xbox version, so obviously I was excited to test it out. Several commenters told me they'd had issues with older cards, so obviously this was something I'd have to look into. I'm aware that Halo Infinite can be an exceptionally demanding title, so I plan to test in an empty arena. The Forza Horizon games so far have been wonderfully optimised for PC hardware of all stripes, so I was hopeful that I'd be able to keep testing this new game in the series on some old cards throughout 2022. The built-in benchmark run is actually far more demanding than the game itself, presenting an absolute worst-case scenario for any graphics card being tested. Finally, Epic's most profitable tech demo, Fortnite, has entered its 3rd chapter since I last tested a GCN card. Given the continuing popularity of the game, plus its position as the launchpad for new tech, it's always worth a look. I tested in solo battle royale gameplay as usual, though as I'm still new to this map, I did struggle somewhat to maintain a consistent run. The Tahiti GPU in the R9 280 celebrates its 10th birthday this month, so the fact that it's remained fairly relevant this long is certainly worth celebrating. I hoped that a suitable present for the old girl was a nice new set of drivers to help fix some bugs and maybe, with a little luck, see some improved performance. Doom Eternal, tested with the legacy 21.5.2 driver set, continues to exhibit glitches. 2D elements of the UI occasionally take on some weird pixelation, as do some textures on environments and NPCs. Most notable, at least to me, are the glowing Mancubi, which it took me a long time to realise wasn't actually supposed to be happening. Switching the drivers out for the custom NimeZ package, perhaps surprisingly, actually manages to fix all of the visual glitches. As for performance, my standard benchmark with the legacy drivers turned in just over 70 FPS at 1080 low. The upgrade managed a similar average, only a couple of points lower, at 68 FPS. Halo Infinite started with an error message. Apparently this is one of the growing list of titles that demands the full DX12 feature set, which GCN 1 simply doesn't have. Updating the drivers, even to the latest NimeZ version, wasn't going to help. Forza Horizon 5, however, launches fine without the DX12 feature set. Alas, like Doom Eternal, regardless of whether the game is running at low, medium or high settings, there is the occasional flickering texture and weird visual glitch, as can be seen in the license plates, for example. Updating to 21.12.1 drivers seems to fix most of the glitches, though the license plates are still messed up. Regular gameplay saw a healthy 40 to 60 FPS with the 21.5.2 drivers. However, for fairness, I ran the very demanding internal benchmark, which came back at just 31 FPS on average. Installing the NimeZ drivers had precisely zero effect on performance. Fortnite definitely doesn't run like I remember from the last chapter. With the 21.5.2 drivers installed, I didn't notice any glitches or errors, but I did notice frame rates down in the 60s. The average scored 76, with 1% lows in the 20s, as one comes to expect with this game. But that average was down a quarter from the score of a year ago. Could this be down to the driver? As it turns out, no. FPS was close enough on a second run that I think this was just how Fortnite is now. I guess having access to the performance beta rendering mode means artists don't have to make things as scalable in regular DX12. Or maybe they just suck, I don't know. The R9 290 cards represent pretty awesome value, or at least they did before jackasses like me started pointing that out. While this GCN 2 card hasn't presented many issues yet, there are still some to be found that hopefully new drivers can fix. Doom Eternal doesn't exhibit the texture issues of GCN 1 cards in 21.5.2, and so there didn't really seem to be anything to fix. This, as it turns out, isn't 100% true, and I'll talk more about that later, but testing at 1080 medium saw little change in image quality and performance was roughly equal. Halo Infinite actually booted with the R9 290, so any benchmarking results will automatically be infinitely better than the previous gen cards. However, that's where the good news ends for the legacy drivers. Performance at 1080 low in an empty arena failed to reach the cinematic heights of 24 FPS. Even dropping to 75% render scaling only lifted this as high as 25, so something's clearly wrong here. Could it be the drivers? In a word, holy fucking shitballs, yes! Performance leapt over 100%, with 1080 low managing a very playable average of 49 FPS. Now, I might have got a bit excited and forgot to retest at 75%, but I'll do some proper benchmarks in live play and in campaign mode in my full R9 290 review in February. Forza Horizon 5 is up next, and we maybe have to start tempering expectations a little here. The visual glitch I first noticed in the R9 280 stands out even more when there are volumetrics on screen. Any decals with an alpha channel have an issue where the transparency doesn't work properly and the background turns black, which can affect license plates, paint jobs and crowds at a distance. I did check a few different quality settings and the issue persisted, and switching up to the NimeZ drivers did nothing to improve matters. As for performance, the 290 actually suffered a small step back in the latest drivers. It's only a single digit delta and it's probably not enough to hold you back from using NimeZ, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Finally, Fortnite at a mix of high and epic settings looks really good and plays really well on both driver sets. At least on the current update, Chapter 3 Season 1, I didn't notice any visual difference between 21.5.2 and 21.12.1, and performance was within the margin of error. If you're looking to build a PC purely for Fortnite and have an R9 290 in mind, you probably don't need to go to the effort of installing the NimeZ drivers, at least for the time being. GCN 3 has impressed me so far. The R9 380 and R9 Nano videos from last year show the architecture's held up pretty well, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement. As I had a little extra performance headroom this time, I pushed Doom Eternal up to high settings, and this exposed an issue I've seen before. With the higher shadow settings enabled, the legacy drivers cause the shadows to render almost like they're being cast through wicker, there's a weird checkerboard effect to the shadows, and although I didn't test the R9 290 at high, it's entirely possible this problem might exist on that card too. Thankfully, the NimeZ driver set completely fixes this issue. Performance is once more close enough to call a tie, but the fixed shadows tell me that the NimeZ drivers would be a good choice for anyone looking to play Doom Eternal on this card. Halo Infinite once more gives bizarrely poor performance on the Fury X using the official drivers, basically matching the R9 290 at 1080 low. Switching out the drivers, and again we see the most phenomenal improvement, more than doubling the frame rate from 23 to 58 FPS. I'll look at the R9 Fury X in Halo Infinite in more detail in the coming weeks, as I suspect in gameplay you're probably going to want to turn the resolution scaler down to get an optimal experience. Forza Horizon 5 actually suffers a lot of the same visual problems on the Fury X as were seen on the 290. Again, the most obvious issue is the license plates, but that alpha glitch is probably going to distract you from time to time. And so far the driver updates have done nothing to fix that problem. Both the Legacy and NimeZ driver sets see over 50 FPS on average in the built-in benchmark, with very little to discern between the two. Finally, Fortnite once more looks exactly the same regardless of the drivers used. The benchmark results from 1080 high with epic view distance are excellent in both cases, and close enough to once again call a tie. But now that I come to think of it, there is actually a noticeable trend across all three cards. Although it's hard to keep consistent benchmarks between matches, and mine isn't the most scientific of methods out there, I can't help but notice all three cards tested just slightly faster on the Legacy 21.5.2 drivers than on the NimeZ 21.12.1 set. I wouldn't make too much of this, but to tell the absolute truth, it does look like the older drivers extract ever so slightly more performance from the older GCN cards in this specific title. Now, with all that said, I don't want to leave you all with the idea that this is a no-brainer. NimeZ drivers aren't as easy to install or update as the official drivers, and stable operation is not guaranteed. While I haven't had any issues in my testing, I have heard of other people who weren't quite so lucky. You probably shouldn't bank on NimeZ drivers in the long term unless you're willing to go through some troubleshooting if things should go wrong. Are they worth the effort? Well, depending on the game, yes, very much so. Arguably, if you're looking at playing older titles, or at least ones released before May 2021 and that haven't seen sizable updates since then, you won't see a big improvement in performance. However, Doom Eternal shows that there have been big, glaring issues since then that anyone sticking to the Legacy driver set wouldn't ever see fixed. Forza Horizon 5 shows there's still work to be done, and if it is ever fixed, then NimeZ is probably the only way GCN owners will ever get to see the result. Halo Infinite shows the kind of night and day improvements that drivers can make on hardware that is technically obsolete, though Fortnite shows that we shouldn't necessarily expect performance improvements across the board. I'm putting together a little guide video on installing the NimeZ drivers for those looking to try them out. It should be linked on screen right now when it's gone live, as is the official instruction video, and everything referred to is linked in the description. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.